Okay, today I'm going to be talking to you about the history of bilingual education. So throughout this unit, I learned a lot about the history of bilingual education, and it actually started way back when America started, specifically in Texas. It started around the 1830s when Texas was founded. There was already flourishing bilingual education um, in the communities. The communities actually came together, and the people in it would create their own schools or create programs which bilingual education was put together. So in Texas, there was a lot of German, um, Czech, and Polish settlers that began to create their own schools where both English and their native language was used. And the law was required that they taught English, but it did not outlaw the teaching of any other languages, which is why many schools were bilingual. And then the early German communities in Texas are actually credited for establishing one of the first bilingual schools near San Antonio. And they taught English, German, and then they eventually also added Spanish, so they were learning 3 languages at that school. Bilingual education continued to be an informal, casual kind of part of the regular schools until the Progressive Era started. And in 1918 was actually when the law was passed that required schools to only teach English as an instructional language, and that they couldn't use any native language. And it was during this progressive era that the schools moved from those like common schools ran by communities to districts that were overseen by regulators and representatives in Austin. And this law was all part of efforts to Americanize all the immigrants coming into the state because there was a lot of immigration during this time. And they also wanted to unify the statewide education so that all districts were kind of similar in the way that they taught and the way their schools were set up. So not only did this implement like English only, but it also meant that they couldn't speak any Spanish or whatever their home language be in the schools. So the video history of bilingual education in Texas, it was actually really interesting listening to the guy talk about it because he was saying that they would get in trouble for speaking Spanish just at school. Like one day he was walking in the hallway and he said something to his friend in Spanish and he got sent to the principal's office. And he was sharing that a lot of times, like when he would go to the principal for getting in trouble for this, there would be a line of many students getting in trouble for the same reason. So it wasn't just like they couldn't teach in English or teach in a different language and provide those like programs to help students who didn't speak English, but they couldn't even like talk casually to their friends with it. And I just thought that was really interesting and weird to think about. The school system pretty much stayed the same from that all the way up until the civil rights movement. In the civil rights movement, a lot of times people just think about race and Brown versus Board of Education. They don't really think about any of the other effects that it had, but it actually had a big effect on bilingual education. So the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and it specifically banned discrimination on sex, race, and national origin in public facilities. But it actually opened the door to bilingual education and helped shed light on the discrimination that was still around in the school systems, not just based on race and on color, but on culture as a whole. So, including the language barriers that were set and that English only law that was set in. And it was from this point forward that things began to improve. And it didn't improve instantly. Obviously, as we learned, it was kind of a long journey for bilingual education, but it made the steps of people starting to kind of fight back for their rights. And so it opened a lot of court cases and a lot of laws that were passed. And a quote from the textbook that I found interesting that kind of like proved the point was, within the context of the civil rights movement, educators and policymakers became more sensitive to the needs of the rapidly growing language minority student population. So this just proves that the civil rights movement actually opened the door, and people became more aware of bilingual education and how they were being discriminated against. So right after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was passed by Congress, and this was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson as part of his war on poverty that he was implementing. And the act provided funds and policies and procedures that targeted students of low income families, but through this, it also provided financial aid to help English learner programs that were in schools. And this was actually reauthorized 6 times. So it came out in 1965, and then it was reauthorized and added to in 1974, 1978, 1984, 1988, 1994, and then the last time in 2001. And it was this act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that were vitally important to improving the schooling for English language learners. The Title VII Bilingual Education Act was passed on January 2nd, 1968, and it was signed in by Lyndon B. Johnson. And this was actually a part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was talked about in the previous slide, but it was a lot more specific to bilingual education. So it actually authorized resources to support educational programs, and on top of that, it trained teachers and aides, developed instructional materials, and it really encouraged parental involvement. So it was a lot more complex and more specific towards bilingual education. But each time the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized, I said in the last slide that it was reauthorized 6 times. They were all for the Bilingual Education Act. And the last time it was authorized in 2001, the 3 key points from it were that it expanded the types of programs eligible for funds, it increased support for development and dual language programs, and it really just had a greater focus on the overall benefits of bilingual education. So like I said, it was reauthorized 6 times. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the specific Bilingual Education Act had a huge impact on the overall bilingual education history movement. So in 1969, there was a protest in Crystal City, which was organized by students, where 100 students did a walkout from their school. And I learned about this in the video, The History of Bilingual Education in Texas, and I just found it really interesting. It was part of the Chicano movement, and the students at that school basically just got so tired of the discrimination that they were receiving. The people in the video said that they were getting called names, they were getting in trouble by teachers and principals for just speaking their native language. One guy was saying that they would get made fun of because they brought tacos to school for lunch, and that was just wild to me. But it really was a defining moment for the bilingual education movement in Texas. There were other walkouts around the same time for the same reason, but this was marked as one of the more notable ones in Texas. And they really were just protesting the segregated atmosphere in their school and the English-only curriculum and the fact that they couldn't even speak English in their school. Lau versus Nichols was a court case originally in 1970. It was a little boy who was Chinese and he didn't speak or understand English, and he was in school, but he was failing because he could not understand the language of instruction. And so the lawyer said that he was being denied equal education because of this language barrier. And the court actually ruled that there was equal education and that it wasn't their fault or responsibility that this child came into their school not knowing English, and they kind of just took the no blame fall for it. And then in 1974, so 4 years later, the Supreme Court actually overruled this and said that there was no equality of treatment. They said that providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculums for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education, meaning that even though you're providing the same things for each child, the same books, the same teachers, the same curriculum, if they don't understand the language, then it's not equal education because they're not getting anything from it, they don't understand it. And this case was known as the end of the sink or swim approach, and that they were required to provide special assistance. So students like the boy in this case, students who don't understand that language, they are they can receive special assistance. They qualify for special assistance. In this case, overall, led to Lau remedies, which were in August 11th, 1975. And law remedies were basically guidelines and rules, kind of, if you say, that help districts evaluate English language learners and provide specific help and programs and like instructions that they needed to make sure that these students get what they need to be successful. Aspira of New York City versus Board of Education was a court case that I learned about in one of the videos, A Historical Background of Bilingual Education, and it was in 1974. And basically, the state didn't offer schooling for children who did not speak English, and so they weren't getting that equal education, and they heard about Law versus Nichols, that court case, and the ruling in that, and they wanted to implement that in New York City. So it was a case based on discrimination. The children were being ignored, and the guy in the video actually said this line, which has really stuck with me. It was like a good representation of it. He said that having a child who doesn't speak the instructional language in your classroom is like having a deaf child sitting in the classroom who's not getting any help whatsoever. So it's kind of that same mentality that if you're speaking English and you have a child who doesn't know any English, they're kind of like a deaf person who's not getting a translator, doesn't have a hearing aid or anything like that. They just can't understand you and there's no help for them. So this case resulted in them forcing the school to implement bilingual education techniques to effectively instruct all children. So basically, teachers providing those programs and those help for English language learners. Castaneda versus Pickard was another court case in 1981, and this came from the Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, which stated appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in its instructional programs. And from that, it was like an unclear understanding of what appropriate action meant. So Castaneda versus Pickard was an attempt to define exactly what appropriate action meant. And from this court case, it basically said that it's not good enough just to say you tried and you put good faith efforts, was the quote in there. But it put all its weight in backing up the Lau versus Nichols case and saying that it violates civil rights of language minority children even when it's not deliberate discrimination. So a lot of teachers were saying that they're not deliberately discriminating against the children in their classroom, even they just don't speak the correct language. And it was saying that like that excuse basically isn't good enough. You have to provide ways to help these English language learners in your classroom. And it gave criteria for the programs to define what the appropriate action was. So the 3 criteria for the programs were that it must be based on sound education theory, it must be implemented effectively with adequate resources and personnel, and after a trial period, it must be evaluated as effective in overcoming language handicaps. So those are kind of the 3 criteria that kind of lay out the guidelines of what the program should look like. The most recent one that we learned about in our textbook was the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. And just because of where I am in my age, this was the one that I was most familiar with. It was passed by President George W. Bush, and it was his plan to reauthorize the Elementary Secondary Education Act, that Bilingual Education Act, and it provided funds to programs that met the 2 requirements that they had to be teaching English and teach academic content as outlined in state English language proficiency in academic standards. So if you met those 2 requirements, then you could get funding for your programs. But in order to continue to get the funding, you have to submit your plans to receive the funds to show them that you're using language instruction curriculum that is scientifically based research on teaching these types of children. and that it's demonstrated to be effective. So basically, that's saying like you have to submit your plan showing that you're using a good program that is scientifically based, that is proved that it's going to work, and it's appropriate for the children, and that it's demonstrated to be effective. So they know that their money is going to good use and that these children are actually getting help. So, in conclusion, the video was saying that it was a 100-year journey to get us to where we are today with bilingual education, and I can totally believe that after learning about all these different laws and court cases and protests that were involved in this process. In all of these events, I only named 10 of them, and there was more than that, but all of them played such a significant role in getting bilingual education and schooling to where it is today. And I think it's obviously a lot better than where it was, and that it can still be improved. And as a future educator, I'm definitely going to remember these things and use these things in my future classroom, and having that mindset of I'm going to do whatever I can to help these English language learners succeed in my classroom just as much as a native English speaking child would.